There's a special kind of loneliness that comes from watching life pass you by while everyone else finds their place in the world. At 40 winters, Brynhild the healer had made peace with being the woman no one chose, until she decided to choose for herself. In a Viking village, where women waited to be picked like flowers in a field, she had spent years tending the wounded and delivering babies while younger women found husbands. Then a giant warrior named Einar returned from exile, broken and silent, seeking nothing from anyone. Where others saw a defeated man, Brinhild saw possibility. One morning at the village market, she did something no woman had ever dared. She knelt beside him and asked a question that would change everything. In a world where marriages were business deals, she offered her heart to a stranger. But what happens when a woman who has nothing left to lose takes the greatest risk of all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a widow's veil, and Brynhild pulled her woolen cloak tighter as she made her way through the village of Ravenshollow. Her worn leather healing pouch bounced against her hip with each step, its familiar weight a comfort she had carried for more years than she cared to count. The pouch held dried willow bark for pain, meadow sweet for fevers, and valerian root for those who couldn't find sleep, remedies for every ailment except the one that had settled deep in her own bones. At 40 winters, Brynhild had grown accustomed to being invisible. She moved through the settlement like morning fog, noticed only when someone needed her skills. The young mothers called for her when their time came, the warriors sought her when wounds festered, and the elders summoned her when death knocked at their doors. But when the work was done, when the babies were delivered and the wounds bound, she returned to her small cottage on the village's edge, alone with her herbs and her thoughts. The village was stirring to life around her. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the smell of barley porridge mingled with the salt air. Children emerged from longhouses, their voices bright as birdsong, while their mothers called after them with warnings about staying close to home. Brynhild watched a young couple share a quiet word by their doorway, the man's hand resting protective on his wife's rounded belly. She had delivered their first child 2 winters past, a squalling red-faced boy who was now chasing chickens through the muddy lanes. She had delivered most of the children in Ravenshollow, had eased their passage into the world with steady hands and gentle words. Yet she would never know the joy of feeling life quicken in her own womb, would never have a man's hand rest protective on her belly. The village women were kind enough to her face, grateful for her skills, but she heard their whispers when they thought she couldn't listen. Poor Brynhild, they said. Too plain for the warriors, too sharp-tongued for the farmers. The gods meant for her to tend others, not to have a family of her own. Perhaps they were right. She had stopped believing otherwise long ago. The village of Ravenshollow sat like a collection of weathered stones in the crook of a protected bay. Wooden longhouses with turf roofs lined the main path, their carved dragon heads glaring out toward the restless sea. Beyond the settlement, steep cliffs rose like the walls of Asgard itself, painted gold and orange in the early light. It was a hard place for hard people, where strength was currency and weakness was a luxury none could afford. Here, a woman's worth was measured in beauty and fertility, her value determined by the alliances her marriage could forge. A plain woman, past childbearing age, was a burden, tolerated only if she possessed skills the community needed. Brinhild possessed such skills in abundance, but they brought respect without affection, necessity without love. She had been born to Ragnar the smith and his wife Astrid, both long dead now. Her father had been a practical man who taught her that iron bent to will and patience. Her mother had been a dreamer who filled her daughter's head with tales of love that conquered kingdoms and hearts that chose their own destiny. From her father, Brinhild learned the value of useful work. From her mother, she inherited a dangerous belief that a woman might shape her own fate. The belief had cost her dearly over the years. As a young woman, she had refused 3 marriage offers. Men who wanted her healing skills more than her heart, who saw in her a useful addition to their households rather than a partner for their lives. Each refusal had narrowed her choices. Each passing season had dimmed her prospects. By 30, she was considered an oddity. By 35, a cautionary tale. Now, at 40, she was simply part of the village furniture, as permanent and unremarkable as the old oak that grew beside the well. The market square was beginning to fill as she approached. Traders displayed their wares on rough wooden tables, silver arm rings that caught the morning light, bolts of wool in rich blues and greens, amber beads that held the warmth of summer. The fishermen had returned with the dawn tide, and there, wives were arranging the catch on beds of seagrass, the scales silver bright and eyes still clear. Brinhild paused at Olaf the trader's stall, running her fingers over a bolt of soft grey wool. It would make a fine winter cloak, warm against the harsh winds that swept down from the mountains. But such luxuries were not for her. Her simple brown dress and patch cloak served well enough for her purposes. "Good morning, Brynhild." Olaf's greeting was polite but distant. "How fares young Gunnar? I heard he took a fever." "He mends well," she replied. "The willow bark broke his fever yesterday. He'll be back to his mischief within a few days." Olaf nodded and turned his attention to a customer with silver to spend. Brynhild moved on, accustomed to such brief exchanges. She was valued for her knowledge, but not invited to linger. Needed, but not wanted. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the full scope of the village in harsh detail. Ravenshollow was prosperous by the standards of such settlements, its people well-fed, and its buildings sound. The longhouses were arranged around the central square, like the spokes of a great wheel, with the largest belonging to Thorvald, the chieftain, at the far end. His hall dominated the others, its roof peaked higher and its walls carved with scenes of battle and victory. Thorvald ruled Ravenshollow with the iron authority of a man who had never known defeat. He was tall and golden-haired, with the kind of presence that commanded attention when he entered a room. His word was law, his judgment final. Under his leadership, the village had grown wealthy through trade and raiding, its warriors feared along the northern coasts. But prosperity had made him rigid, suspicious of anything that might upset the careful balance he had created. Change was his enemy, and tradition his greatest ally. It was then, as Brynhild made her way toward the baker's stall, that she saw him. The giant sat alone on a wooden bench outside the alehouse, his massive frame dwarfing the furniture beneath him. He was perhaps 50 winters, his dark hair streaked with silver and his face marked by years of weather and warfare. Scars traced pale lines across his hands and forearms, and his eyes held the distant look of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. Einar Ironhand had returned to Ravenshollow after 15 years of exile. Brynhild remembered him from before, though they had never spoken. He had been one of Thorvald's most trusted warriors, a giant among men who wielded his battle-axe with deadly grace. The song said he could split a man from crown to groin with a single blow, that enemy warriors fled rather than face his terrible strength. But the man sitting alone in the morning light bore little resemblance to the hero of those tales. This Einar was bent beneath the weight of invisible burdens, his shoulders curved as though he carried the sorrows of the world. His clothes were simple and travel-worn, his once magnificent weapons nowhere to be seen. Where the young warrior had radiated power and confidence, this older man seemed to have folded in upon himself, seeking to take up as little space as possible. In a world that no longer had use for him, the villagers gave him a wide berth as they went about their morning business. Some stared openly, whispering among themselves about his unexpected return. Others pretended not to see him, uncomfortable with the reminder of past glories fallen to ruin. Children pointed until their mothers hushed them with sharp words, and hurried them away. Brynhild found herself studying him with a healer's eye. She saw the way he favored his left leg, the careful movements that spoke of old wounds that had never properly healed. His breathing was shallow, and there was a grey cast to his skin that suggested illness or deep exhaustion. But more than his physical ailments, she recognized the signs of a wounded spirit, the hollow look of a man who had lost more than he could bear. She knew that look well. She saw it in her own reflection often enough. As if sensing her regard, Einar raised his head and met her eyes. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the busy square, the forgotten healer and the fallen hero, two souls that life had pushed to the margins. There was no recognition in his gaze, no spark of interest. He was looking through her rather than at her, seeing nothing worthy of attention. It should have stung, that dismissal. It should have been just another reminder of her invisibility. Instead, Brinhild felt something stir in the depths of her chest, a warmth she had thought long dead, a flutter of possibility she had buried beneath years of resignation. Here was a man who asked for nothing, who expected nothing, who had been broken by the world as surely as she had been ignored by it. Here was someone who might understand the weight of solitude, the ache of being forgotten. Here was a person who, like her, had nothing left to lose. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a strange sense of recognition, as though she had finally found something she had been searching for without knowing it was lost. The words left Brynhild's mouth before she could call them back. "Will you be my husband?" She had crossed the market square without conscious thought, her feet carrying her toward the giant, while her mind screamed warnings. Now she knelt beside his bench, her hands folded in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The question hung in the morning air between them, impossible to unsay, too bold to believe. Einar turned to look at her properly for the first time, his dark eyes widening in surprise. Up close, she could see the lines that pain had carved around his eyes, the silver threading through his beard. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, pale against his weathered skin. He studied her as though she were a puzzle he couldn't solve, this plain woman who had dared to speak the unspoken. "What did you say?" His voice was rough from disuse, deep as distant thunder. "I asked if you would be my husband." The words came easier the second time, though her cheeks burned with embarrassment. "I know it's not the way things are done. I know women don't ask such questions. But I'm 40 winters old, and I've spent them all waiting for someone else to. You'll choose my fate. I'm tired of waiting." Around them, the market had fallen silent. Traders paused in their haggling. Fishwives stopped their calling. Children stared with open mouths. Even the gulls seemed to sense the moment's gravity, their cries muted as they wheeled overhead. Brinhild felt the weight of every gaze, heard the sharp intake of breath from a dozen throats. She had just shattered every convention their world held sacred. Einar continued to stare at her, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "You don't know me, woman. You don't know what I've done, where I've been. You don't know why I left this place or why I've returned." "I know you're alone," Brinhild replied. "I know you've been hurt by the world, same as I have. I know you're sitting here with no one to care whether you live or die, and that's a feeling I understand better than most." A murmur rippled through the watching crowd, voices raised in shock and dismay. Brinhild heard fragments of angry words, shameless, unseemly, against all custom and law. She kept her eyes fixed on Einar's face, trying to read his thoughts. In the lines around his eyes, "You offer yourself to a stranger," he said quietly, "to an exile, to a man with no land, no wealth, no future worth claiming. Why?" The question pierced her like a blade. Why, indeed? What madness had possessed her to throw away the last shreds of her dignity on this impossible gesture? She searched for words that might make sense of the impulse that had driven her across the square. "Because I'm tired of being half alive," she said at last. Because I've spent 40 years being useful instead of being wanted. Because when I look at you, I don't see a defeated man. I see someone who might understand what it means to hope for something different. Before Einar could respond, a commanding voice cut through the morning air. What madness is this? Thorvald the chieftain strode across the square, his golden hair gleaming in the sunlight, his blue cloak billowing behind him like a war banner. The crowd parted before him as water parts before the prow of a longship. His face was dark with anger, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. "Brinhild the healer," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You forget yourself and shame our village with this unseemly display. Rise and return to your proper duties before you make more of a spectacle than you already." Brinhild felt her courage waver under his stern gaze. Thorvald was not a man to be defied lightly. His word was law in Raven's Hollow, his judgment final. To continue this path would mean defying him openly, something that could bring consequences she wasn't prepared to face. But she remained on her knees. "I shame no one," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I ask only what any free woman might ask, for the right to choose her own fate." Thorvald's eyes flashed with dangerous fire. "Free women do not propose marriage like merchants hawking wares in the marketplace. Free women wait to be chosen by worthy men, as their fathers and the customs of our people dictate. You mock our traditions with this display." "Our traditions," Brinhild replied, rising slowly to her feet, "have left me alone for 40 years. Perhaps it's time for new traditions." The crowd's murmur grew louder, excited and scandalized. Some voices supported her, mostly from the older women who had also felt the sting of being passed over. Others condemned her boldly, particularly the men who saw her challenge to established order as a threat to their own authority. Through it all, Einar remained silent, watching the confrontation unfold with the detached interest of a man observing events that had little to do with him. Thorvald turned his attention to the giant warrior. "Einar Ironhand, you returned to us after 15 years of exile, and already you bring disruption to our peace. I should have known your presence would breed trouble." "I've done nothing," Einar replied mildly. "I sit where you allow exiles to sit, ask for nothing, trouble no one. If this woman chooses to speak words to me, that's her affair, not mine." "Your very presence encourages this foolishness," Thorvald snapped. "Perhaps it was a mistake to permit your return at all." The threat was clear, hanging in the air like storm clouds. Brinhild felt a surge of protective anger that surprised her with its intensity. She had known this man for mere moments, yet already she couldn't bear the thought of him being driven away because of her rash words. "The fault is mine alone," she said quickly. "Einar bears no responsibility for my actions. If you must punish someone for breaking custom, then punish me." Thorvald studied her with cold calculation. "Indeed, the fault is yours, and there will be consequences for this disruption. But first, we must address the matter properly." He raised his voice so all could hear. "Let it be known that no woman may propose marriage in this village without the consent of the Council of Elders. Such a breach of custom requires formal judgment." The ancient marriage stones stood at the far end of the square, 3 granite pillars carved with runes that had witnessed countless unions over the generations. They were blackened with age and weather, their surfaces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. It was there, according to tradition, that couples pledged their lives to each other before the gods and the community. Brinhild had never expected to stand before those stones. Now it seemed she might face them not as a bride, but as a woman, on trial for daring to choose her own path. "The council will convene at sunset," Thorvald announced. "Until then, both parties will remain in the village. We will settle this matter according to law and custom, not the whims of foolish women." He swept away, his cloak snapping behind him, leaving Brinhild alone with Einar and the whispers of the crowd. The excitement of the moment was fading, replaced by the cold reality of what she had done. She had challenged the very foundations of her world on an impulse, and now she would face the consequences. Einar rose from his bench, towering over her like a mountain wreathed in shadow. For a moment she thought he might speak, might offer some word of comfort or encouragement. Instead, he simply looked at her with something that might have been pity, then walked away without a word. Brinhild stood alone in the square, surrounded by staring faces and whispered judgments. She had asked the unaskable question and received no answer. She had defied tradition and gained nothing but the promise of punishment. She had gambled everything on a moment's courage and lost before the game had even begun. Yet as she made her way back to her cottage, her healing pouch heavy at her side, she found she felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time in her life, she had acted instead of simply enduring. She had chosen instead of waiting to be chosen. Whatever came next, at least she would face it, knowing she had finally found her voice. The silver arm ring had belonged to Brynhild's grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women who had known both sorrow and strength. Brinhild turned it slowly between her fingers as she sat in her cottage that afternoon, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. The metal was warm from her touch, inscribed with runes that spoke of protection and endurance. Her grandmother Seagrid had been a woman of uncommon wisdom, gifted with the sight that let her read the patterns of fate in the flight of ravens and the behavior of flames. She had worn this ring through famine and plenty, through the births of her children and the death of her husband, through all the seasons of a long and purposeful life. "Remember, little one," she had whispered to Brinhild on her deathbed, pressing the ring into her granddaughter's small hands. "A woman's strength doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from knowing her own worth, whether others see it or not." The memory brought both comfort and pain. Seagrid had died when Brinhild was barely 15, taking with her the only person who had ever truly believed in her granddaughter's potential. In the years since, Brinhild had tried to live by that wisdom, but it was hard to remember your worth when the world seemed determined to ignore you. A sharp knock at her door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find young Astrid standing. On her threshold, the girl's usually bright face clouded with worry. "Brinhild," the 17-year-old said breathlessly. "I had to come. Everyone's talking about what happened in the square. They're saying terrible things." "Come in, child." Brynhild stepped aside to let the girl enter. Astrid was the daughter of Bjorn the blacksmith, a pretty thing with golden braids and eyes like summer sky. She should have been thinking of nothing more serious than which young man might court her, not concerning herself with the troubles of a spinster healer. "You were so brave," Astrid said, settling onto a wooden stool beside the fire. "I've never seen anything like it. The way you just walked across the square and said what you wanted. It was like watching one of the old stories come to life." "Brave or foolish," Brinhild replied, pouring ale into 2 wooden cups. "I'm not certain there's a difference." "There is," Astrid insisted. "Foolishness is acting without thought. Bravery is acting despite fear. And you were afraid. I could see it in your face, but you did it anyway." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the crackle of the fire. Outside, Brinhild could hear voices passing on the lane, fragments of conversation that told her she was the subject of much discussion. "My mother says you've lost your mind," Astrid admitted. "She says no good can come of defying Thorvald and the old ways, but some of the other women, the older ones who never married or whose husbands died young, they're saying different things." "Or what are they saying?" "That maybe it's time someone spoke for the rest of us. That maybe if a woman can choose her own husband, she might choose other things too. Where to live, what work to do, whether to have children or not." Astrid's voice grew excited. "Imagine if we didn't have to wait for fathers and brothers to decide our fates. Imagine if we could shape our own lives." The girl's enthusiasm was infectious, but Brynhild tempered it with hard-earned wisdom. "Change comes with a price, Astrid. Those who challenge the old ways rarely escape unscathed. I may have opened a door today, but I don't yet know what waits on the other side." But you're not sorry. Brynhild considered the question carefully. The rational part of her mind catalogued all the reasons she should regret her impulsive action. She had exposed herself to public humiliation, defied the most powerful man in the village, and likely doomed herself to whatever punishment the council deemed appropriate. By any measure, it had been a catastrophic mistake. Yet when she searched her heart, she found no regret. Only a strange sense of lightness, as though she had finally set down a burden she had carried for too long. "No," she said at last, "I'm not sorry." As evening approached, more visitors came to her door. Some were women who offered quiet words of support, speaking in whispers as though afraid of being overheard. Others came with sharp tongues and sharper criticism, warning her that her actions had brought shame upon all the unmarried women of the village. The most painful visit came from Helga, wife of Gunnar the merchant and mother of 4 daughters. She was a woman Brinhild had always respected, known for her practical wisdom and kind heart, but the face that greeted Brinhild was cold with disappointment. "You've made it harder for all of us," Helga said without preamble. "Do you think the men will be more inclined to marry our daughters now that you've shown them what happens when women get ideas above their station? You've given them reason to fear us, to see us as threats to their authority. Or perhaps," Brynhild replied carefully, "I've shown your daughters that they have choices their mothers never imagined." "Choices?" Helga's laugh was bitter. "What choice did you offer them? The choice to end up alone and scorned. The choice to be remembered as the woman who couldn't keep her tongue in her head." The words stung because they held a grain of truth. Brynhild had acted without considering the consequences for other women, had thought only of her own desperate loneliness and need for something different. Perhaps Helga was right. Perhaps she had made things worse for everyone. But before she could voice her doubts, another knock came at the door. This time, it was Ragnhild, the village's oldest widow, her silver hair braided with dignity despite her threadbare dress. "Pay no mind to the frightened chickens," the old woman said, clearly having overheard Helga's criticism. "They cluck and fuss because they've never known what it is to spread their wings." Helga's face reddened. "And what? Would you know of it, Ragnhild? You were married at 16 and widowed at 20. You've had 50 years to forget what it means to need a man's protection. I know what it means to make my own way in a world that would rather I disappear," Ragnhild replied sharply. "I know what it costs to survive on scraps of charity and the grudging respect earned through decades of useful work. And I know courage when I see it, even if it frightens those who have never possessed it." The confrontation ended with Helga storming out, leaving Brynhild and Ragnhild alone beside the dying fire. The old woman settled into her chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones had grown brittle with age. "You've started something today that can't be easily stopped," she said quietly. "The question is whether you have the strength to see it through to the end." "I don't know," Brynhild admitted. "I spoke without thinking, acted on impulse. Now I face the council's judgment, and I'm not sure I'm prepared for what they might decide. The council will do what councils always do. They'll try to preserve the order that serves them best. But you've planted a seed in the minds of every woman in this village, and seeds have a way of growing in unexpected directions." Ragnhild reached into her pouch and pulled out something wrapped in soft cloth. She placed it on the table between them, unwrapping it to reveal a small silver pendant shaped like a tree. "This was my mother's," she said, "and her mother's before that. It represents the world tree Yggdrasil, whose roots run deep and whose branches touch the heavens. Take it, child, wear it to remind yourself that some things endure not because they bend with every wind, but because they grow strong through standing firm." The healing garden behind Brynhild's cottage had been her sanctuary for 20 years. Here, among the carefully tended rows of herbs and medicinal plants, she found the peace that eluded her in the village proper. The morning sun slanted through, the wooden fence, casting patterns of light and shadow across beds of chamomile and feverfew, while bees hummed drowsily among the lavender blooms. She was harvesting mint when she heard the gate creak open behind her. Turning, she saw Einar standing uncertainly at the garden's entrance, his massive frame seeming oddly vulnerable in the delicate space she had created. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, his deep voice careful and polite. "I wanted to speak with you before the council meets tonight." "You're welcome here." Brinhild set down her gathering basket and wiped her hands on her apron. "Though I must warn you, my garden isn't built for men of your size. Mind the bee-skeps, they're protective of their territory." He moved carefully among the planted beds, his warrior's grace evident even in this domestic setting. She watched him pause beside a patch of comfrey, his scarred fingers brushing the broad leaves with surprising gentleness. "My mother had a garden like this," he said quietly. "Smaller, but she grew many of the same plants. She used to say that healing grew from the earth the same way sickness did. It was all a matter of knowing which seeds to plant. Your mother was wise." Brynhild knelt beside a patch of valerian, pulling weeds from around the pale flowers. "These roots will ease troubled sleep. I gather them in autumn, when their power is strongest." "Do you ever sleep troubled?" The question was asked so quietly she almost missed it. "Every night for the past 20 years, she admitted. "And you?" "Since I was 15 and went on my first raid." Einar lowered himself carefully to sit on the wooden bench she had built against the garden's back wall. The furniture groaned under his weight, but held. "I've grown used to it. Sleep brings dreams, and dreams bring memories better left buried." They worked in companionable silence, Brinhild tending her plants while Einar watched with the focused attention of a man learning something new. She found his presence oddly soothing. He didn't fill the quiet with unnecessary words or feel compelled to offer advice about her gardening methods. He simply existed in the space beside her, solid and reassuring as a standing stone. "Why did you really ask me that question yesterday?" he said eventually. Brinhild sat back on her heels, considering her answer. She had given him the surface truth in the market square, but there were deeper currents she hadn't dared to voice. "Because when I looked at you, I saw myself," she said at last. "Not the way I am, but the way I felt. Alone, set aside, forgotten by a world that once had use for us." She pulled a stubborn dandelion from the soil, shaking dirt from its roots. "I thought perhaps two forgotten people might remember each other." "You're not forgotten. Half the village speaks your name with respect. You've delivered their children, healed their wounds, eased their pain. They need you. Need, yes, but need isn't the same as want, is it? They call for me when someone is dying, but they don't invite me to their feast tables. They trust me with their secrets in the birthing chamber, but they don't include me in their daily joys." She met his eyes steadily. "I suspect you know something of that distinction." Einar was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands. "In my youth I was welcomed everywhere. Warriors competed for my friendship, jarls sought my service, women smiled when I passed. I thought it was affection. It was only after my exile that I learned the difference between being valued for what you can do and being loved for who you are." "And who are you, Einar Ironhand? Beyond the warrior, beyond the exile, who is the man sitting in my garden?" The question seemed to surprise him. He flexed his scarred hands, studying them as though they belonged to a stranger. "I'm not certain I remember anymore. I was 15 when I first took up a sword, 50 when I laid it down. Everything in between was blood and battle, glory and grief. I've forgotten how to be anything else." "Then perhaps it's time to learn." Brinhild rose and moved to a patch of newly sprouted seedlings. "These are sage plants, started from seeds I saved last autumn. In 2 seasons, they'll be tall enough to harvest. In 5, they'll be fully mature, wise with age and potent with power. But today, they're just tender green shoots beginning again." She looked at him meaningfully. "It's never too late to plant new seeds." A child's laughter drifted over the garden wall, followed by the sound of running feet. Young Astrid's voice rose above the others, calling out instructions for some game. Einar smiled at the sound, the first genuine expression of pleasure Brynhild had seen from him. "You like children," she observed. "They don't see the scars first." He replied, "They don't know about the exile or the battles or the mistakes. They just see a man who might throw them higher than their fathers can, or tell them stories about distant lands. Have you ever wanted children of your own?" The smile faded from his face. "Once, long ago, but warriors don't make good fathers. And exiles make even worse ones. Some men aren't meant for such happiness. Some men convince themselves they aren't worthy of it," Brynhild corrected gently. "There's a difference." They were interrupted by another visitor, Bjorn the blacksmith, Astrid's father, who entered the garden with the easy confidence of an old friend. He was a broad-shouldered man with arms like tree trunks and hands permanently stained with soot from his forge. His presence filled the peaceful space with masculine energy, but not unpleasantly so. "Brinhild, my friend," he said, embracing her with the familiarity of long acquaintance. "I came as soon as I could get away from the forge. Astrid told me about yesterday's excitement." He turned to Einar with a warrior's assessing gaze, but his expression warmed with recognition. "And you must be Einar Ironhand. I thought I recognized the shoulders, though you've grown a bit grayer since I last saw you swing an axe." "Bjorn Ironright," Einar replied, rising to clasp the other man's forearm in greeting. "I wondered if you still worked metal in this village. Your blade work was always the finest I'd ever seen." "Still pounding iron and cursing the sparks," Bjorn confirmed with a laugh. "Though these days I make more horseshoes than weapons. Peace is profitable if less exciting than war." The two men fell into easy conversation, sharing memories of battles fought and comrades lost. Brinhild continued her work, listening to their voices with half an ear while she tended her plants. It struck her that this was what she had been, missing all these years. Not just romantic love, but simple companionship, the comfort of shared work and easy conversation. "I heard about the council meeting tonight," Bjorn said eventually. "For what it's worth, I think Thorvald's making more of this than necessary." So a woman asked a question. "Where's the harm in that?" "The harm," Einar replied carefully, "is that questions lead to more questions. And men in power rarely welcome inquiries about why things are as they are. Then perhaps it's time for different men to hold power," Bjorn said, with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted. "His place in the world. Or better yet, perhaps it's time to share power with those who've been denied it too long." As the afternoon sun climbed higher, painting the garden in golden light, Brynhild found herself imagining a different life. One where conversations like this happened daily, where her garden was a gathering place for friends rather than a solitary refuge. One where she was valued not just for her skills, but for her company, where she contributed to the village's joy as well as its survival. It might only be a dream, but for the first time in years, it felt like a dream worth fighting for. The storm arrived without warning, rolling in from the northern sea like the breath of angry gods. One moment the evening sky was clear and star-filled, the next it was black with roiling clouds that turned day to night in the span of a heartbeat. Rain lashed the village with savage intensity, driven horizontal by winds that howled like the voices of the restless dead. Brinhild had been making her way to the great hall for the council meeting when the tempest struck. The first drops caught her in the lane outside Bjorn's smithy, and within moments she was soaked to the skin. Lightning split the sky in brilliant white forks, followed by thunder that shook the very foundations of the earth. She sought shelter in the doorway of the grain storehouse, pressing herself against the wooden door as the storm raged around her. The thick woolen cloak that had seemed adequate for an autumn evening now felt as insubstantial as spider silk against the fury of wind and rain. It was there that Einar found her, appearing out of the storm like a mountain given human form. His own cloak was dark with water, his hair plastered to his skull, but he moved through the tempest with the steady determination of a man who had endured worse hardships than mere weather. "The council meeting is postponed," he said, raising his voice to be heard above the wind. "Thorvald sent word. No one's fool enough to venture out in this." Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and the thunder that followed made speech impossible. In its aftermath, Brinhild realized she was shivering uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form words. "My cottage," she managed. "It's closer than the hall." Einar nodded and stepped beside her, wrapping his storm cloak around them both. The thick wool was blessed with whatever waterproofing he had learned in his travels, and beneath its shelter, the worst of the rain couldn't reach them. Together they hurried through the empty lanes, heads bent against the gale, their bodies pressed close for warmth and protection. Her cottage had never seemed so welcoming. Brinhild fumbled with the door latch, her fingers numb with cold, until Einar gently moved her aside and lifted the iron bar. They stumbled inside together, dripping and breathless, and Brynhild immediately moved to build up the fire from its glowing embers. "Your clothes," Einar said, turning his back with careful courtesy. "You need to get out of them before you catch your death. I'll keep my eyes on the fire." Brynhild's hands shook as she stripped off her soaked dress and undergarments, wrapping herself in the thick woolen blanket she kept beside her bed. Only when she was decently covered did she tell him he could turn around. He had removed his own cloak and outer tunic, leaving him in a simple linen shirt that clung to his broad chest. His dark hair was tousled from the storm, and there was something almost boyish about his appearance that made her heart skip unexpectedly. "Better?" he asked, settling onto the wooden stool beside her fireplace. "Much." She moved to her store of herbs, selecting dried ginger and honey to brew into warming tea. "Though I fear we're here for the night. The storm shows no signs of passing soon." As if to confirm her words, another crack of thunder shook the cottage, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing in the distance. The wind continued its relentless assault, finding every gap in the walls and whistling through with voices that sounded almost human. They sat in companionable silence as the tea steeped, listening to the storm's fury. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the small space felt intimate in a way that made Brinhild acutely aware of every detail. The sound of Einar's breathing, the way the firelight caught the silver in his beard, the careful distance he maintained even in the confines of her tiny home. "Tell me about your exile," she said eventually, offering him a cup of the hot spiced tea. "What really happened?" Einar wrapped his scarred hands around the clay vessel, seeming to draw comfort from its warmth. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, that the question had overstepped some invisible boundary. Then he began to speak, his voice low and measured. "There was a village," he said, "small, defenseless. Thorvald wanted to raid it for slaves and silver, claimed they had insulted his honor by refusing to pay tribute. But I had been there before, knew the people. They were farmers and fishermen, no more threatening than children. Their greatest crime was poverty. They had nothing worth taking." The tea grew cold in Brynhild's hands as she listened. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside the cottage, the only sounds were Einar's quiet words and the crackle of burning wood. I tried to dissuade him, argued for seeking easier prey elsewhere. But Thorvald was young then, hungry for glory and gold. He saw my reluctance as cowardice, my mercy as weakness. So I did the only thing I could. I warned the village of the coming attack. "You betrayed your own Jarl to protect innocents. I saved 37 lives that night," Einar said quietly. "Men, women, and children who would have died or been sold into slavery for the crime of being too weak to defend themselves. But betrayal is betrayal, even when it serves a just cause. Thorvald banished me with the choice of exile or death. I chose exile." Brinhild set down her cup and moved closer to him, close enough to see the old pain that lived behind his eyes. "You were right to do what you did. Perhaps, but righteousness is cold comfort when you're wandering friendless through foreign lands, selling your sword to whoever will pay for it. He met her gaze steadily. I've spent 15 years fighting other men's battles, protecting other men's interests. I've grown rich and poor again a dozen times over, earned fame that I couldn't enjoy, and scars that will never fade. What brought you back? Weariness, he admitted. I'm too old for the mercenary life, too tired to care about anyone else's wars. I thought perhaps I could find some small corner of peace in the place where I was born, even if that peace came with solitude. Another flash of lightning illuminated the cottage, followed immediately by thunder that seemed to shake the world itself. In its wake, Brynhild became aware of how close they were sitting, how the storm had driven them into this intimate space where honesty seemed as natural as breathing. I've been alone for 15 years, Einar continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I've learned to live with solitude, even to welcome it. But yesterday, when you knelt beside me in the square, for the first time in longer than I can remember, I didn't feel quite so alone. The words hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Brynhild felt her heart hammering against her ribs, felt the weight of possibility settling around them like the storm itself. This was the moment she had dreamed of without daring to hope for it, a man seeing her not as useful but as necessary, not as convenient but as chosen. I was terrified, she admitted, standing there in front of everyone, saying words I'd never imagined I'd have the courage to speak. But I wasn't. Sorry, even now, facing whatever judgment the council might pass. I'm not sorry. Nor am I. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough with calluses, his fingers gentle despite their strength. Whatever else comes of this strange courtship, I'm grateful you chose to see something worthy in a broken-down old warrior. You're not broken, Brinhild said firmly. Scarred, perhaps. Weary, but not broken. A broken man doesn't spend 15 years fighting for others' causes. A broken man doesn't choose exile over death to preserve his honor. The stormcloak lay across the back of his chair, and almost without thinking, Brynhild reached for it. The heavy wool was still damp but warm from their shared body heat, and she pulled it around both their shoulders, creating a cocoon of warmth in the flickering firelight. They sat like that as the storm raged outside, two solitary souls who had found unexpected shelter in each other's company, sharing warmth and words and the tentative beginning of something that might, with care and courage, grow into love. The ancient silver wedding crown had lain forgotten in the depths of the village temple for generations, hidden beneath layers of dust and disuse, like a secret waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. It was young Astrid who discovered it 3 days after the storm, while helping her mother clean the sacred space in preparation for the autumn harvest rituals. "Look what I found," she said breathlessly, carrying the tarnished circlet to Brynhild's cottage like a treasure rescued from dragon's hoard. It was wrapped in old linen behind the altar stones, as though someone had hidden it deliberately. Brynhild set down her mortar and pestle, wiping ground herbs from her hands before taking the crown. Despite its age and neglect, the craftsmanship was exquisite. Delicate silver leaves intertwined with tiny flowers, each petal etched with such skill that they seemed ready to bloom. At the crown's center sat a pale blue stone that caught the morning light like captured sky. "It's beautiful," she whispered, turning it carefully in her hands. "But why are you bringing it to me?" Astrid's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Don't you see? It's a sign from the gods themselves. The crown of a Viking bride, discovered just when you need it most. Surely this means your union is blessed." Before Brinhild could respond, footsteps sounded outside her door. Elder Seagrid entered without invitation, her silver hair braided with ribbons despite her advanced age. Behind her came 2 other village women, Ragnhild the widow, and surprisingly Helga, who had been so critical just days before. "So it's true," Seagrid said, her eyes fixed on the crown. "The old wedding crown has been found." "You know of it?" Brinhild asked. know of it. Child, I wore it myself 60 years ago, when I wed my dear Olaf. Sigrid's weathered face softened with memory. As did my mother before me, and her mother before that. It has crowned the heads of Viking brides for more generations than any can count. But it was hidden away, Helga protested. Surely that means it was not meant to be worn again. Hidden, yes, but not lost, Seagrid corrected. My grandmother told me the story. When the new gods came to our lands, when the Christ followers demanded we abandon the old ways, the women of the village hid their most sacred treasures. They would not let conquerors destroy what had blessed their ancestors. Ragnhild leaned heavily on her walking stick as she studied the crown. The old laws are written in silver and stone, not just in the words of men. This crown has power beyond mere decoration. It carries the blessing of all the women who wore it before. What are you suggesting? Brinhild asked, though she suspected she already knew. I'm suggesting, Seagrid said with the authority of her years, that the gods have provided what you need to make your union legitimate in ways that even Thorvald cannot dispute. This crown has sanctified marriages in Raven's Hollow for 300 years. Any bride who wears it enters her marriage with the full blessing of tradition. Astrid clapped her hands together in delight. It's perfect. Brynhild, you could be married properly with all the ancient rites. No one could say your union wasn't blessed. But Helga's expression remained troubled. The crown alone won't be enough to satisfy Thorvald. He'll find other reasons to object, other laws to cite. A woman who proposes marriage to a man, it goes against everything our people believe about the proper order of things. Does it? Sigrid's voice carried the weight of years spent studying the old ways. Or does it go against what men have convinced us to believe? Tell me, Helga, do you know the story of how the gods themselves were married? Helga shook her head, as did the others. Seagrid settled into Brynhild's chair with the careful movements of great age, preparing to share wisdom earned through decades. Of life, in the beginning times when the world was young and the gods walked freely among mortals, there lived a goddess named Var. She was beautiful beyond measure, wise beyond knowing. But she dwelt alone in her crystal hall because no god dared approach her. They feared her power, you see, feared a woman who needed nothing from them. But Var grew lonely in her perfection, and one day she saw a god named Vidar, silent, strong, keeper of vengeance and justice. He sat alone in his iron boots, shunned by his fellow gods for his grim duty. Where others saw only death and judgment, Var saw nobility and sacrifice, so she went to him. She, a goddess, approached him first. She spoke words of binding, offered him her heart, asked him to share his fate with hers. And do you know what happened? What? Astrid breathed, caught up in the tale. The skies themselves rejoiced. The marriage of Var and Vidar brought balance to the 9 realms. Wisdom wedded to justice, beauty joined with strength. Their union was so blessed that they were given dominion over all marriages that followed, charged with protecting those who bound their lives together in love. Sigrid's eyes found Brynhild's and held them steadily. If a goddess can choose her husband-child, then surely a mortal woman can do the same. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the sound of wind stirring the herbs hanging from Brynhild's rafters. The crown seemed to grow warmer in her hands, as though the silver itself responded to the ancient story. But Thorvald will never accept such reasoning, Helga said at last, though her voice lacked its earlier certainty. Thorvald is one man, however powerful, Ragnhild observed. He rules by consent of the people, not by divine right. If enough voices speak in favor of this union, if enough of the old women remember the true ways, even he must listen. The council meeting has been rescheduled for tomorrow night, Seagrid announced. I will speak for you, child, if you wish it. I will tell them what I have told you, that the gods themselves have provided sign of their blessing. Brinhild felt tears prick at her eyes. For 40 years she had stood alone, dependent on no one, valued by few. Now suddenly she found herself surrounded by women who offered not just support, but advocacy, who saw in her struggle a chance to reclaim something that had been taken from all of them. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say yes," Astrid urged. "Say you'll wear the crown and claim your right to choose. Say you'll let us stand with you," Ragnhild added. "Let us be part of changing what needs to be changed. Say you'll trust in the wisdom of women who have walked this path before you," Seagrid concluded. "The crown found its way to light for a reason. Don't let fear keep you from accepting the blessing it offers." Outside, the sound of horses approaching made them all look toward the door. Through the window, Brinhild could see riders in the colours of neighbouring villages, more witnesses arriving for tomorrow's council, drawn by word of the unprecedented situation in Ravenshollow. The stakes were rising, the audience growing. Whatever happened tomorrow would echo far beyond the boundaries of their small settlement, would be carried by traders and travellers to every corner of the northern lands. Brinhild looked down at the crown in her hands, at the delicate silver leaves that had blessed so many unions before hers. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine wearing it, standing before the marriage stones with Einar beside her, speaking vows that would bind their lives together before gods and mortals alike. It was a beautiful dream. Whether it would remain only a dream or become glorious reality would depend on tomorrow's judgment, and on whether she had the courage to claim what the gods seemed to be offering. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'll wear the crown. I'll trust in the blessing it carries, and I'll let you stand with me whatever comes." The women smiled, and for the first time since this strange courtship began, Brynhild felt she might not be facing her fate alone. The blood oath ring arrived with the dawn, carried by a messenger whose horse was lathered with sweat from hard. Riding through the night, Brynhild saw the rider approach from her cottage window, watched him dismount before Thorvald's hall with the urgency of a man bearing news that could not wait for proper ceremony. She was braiding her hair in preparation for the council meeting when Einar knocked at her door. One look at his face told her that something had gone terribly wrong. "We need to talk," he said, his voice hollow as an empty grave. In his hand he held a small iron ring, black as winter night and inscribed with runes that seemed to drink the morning light. "What is it?" she asked, though dread was already settling in her stomach like a stone. "A reminder of a promise I made long ago," he replied, stepping into her cottage and closing the door behind him. "A vow I thought buried with the past, but apparently the dead have longer memories than I hoped." He held up the ring so she could see it clearly. The iron was old, worn smooth by years of handling, but the runes carved into its surface remained sharp and clear. They spoke of binding and blood, of oaths that transcended death itself. 15 years ago, before my exile, I was promised in marriage to a woman named Ingrid Eriksdottir. Our fathers arranged the match when we were both children, sealed it with this ring and vows spoken before the gods. But when I was banished, the engagement was dissolved, or so I believed. Brynhild's world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. And now? Now her father is dead, and she claims the right to hold me to the original contract. The messenger brought word that she rides to Ravenshollow with a dozen armed men, demanding that I honor my blood oath or face the consequences of breaking it. The ring seemed to pulse with malevolent life in his palm, and Brinhild understood, with sickening clarity, that all their hopes, all their tentative dreams, were crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. "When will she arrive?" she asked, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Before sunset, in time for the council meeting." Einar's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "It seems the gods have a sense of humor after all. What does this mean for us?" "It means," came a new voice from the doorway, "that your little romance was built on a foundation of lies." Thorvald stood framed in the entrance, his golden hair gleaming in the morning sun, his face set in lines of grim satisfaction. Behind him stood two of his warriors, hands resting casually on their sword hilts. "How dare you enter my home uninvited?" Brynhild said, rising to face him with all the dignity she could muster. "I enter as chieftain of this village, investigating a matter that concerns the honor of our people," Thorvald replied smoothly. "It seems our returned exile neglected to mention certain complications when he allowed you to make your shameful proposition." "I thought the contract void," Einar said quietly. "Exile dissolves all previous obligations. It's written in law." "Ah, but you weren't exiled by legal judgment, were you?" Thorvald's smile was sharp as a blade. "You were given a choice, exile or death. You chose exile voluntarily, which means your contracts and obligations remain valid. A fine legal distinction, but an important one." The trap was elegant in its simplicity, and Brinhild realized with dawning horror that Thorvald had orchestrated all of this. He had allowed Einar to return, had permitted their courtship to develop, had let hope bloom in her heart, all so he could crush it more completely when the moment was right. "You knew," she breathed. "You knew about this blood oath all along." "I know everything that happens in my domain," Thorvald replied. "I know when exiles return bearing unfinished business. I know when women forget their proper place. And I know when situations require careful management." "You sent for her," Einar accused, his voice thick with betrayal. "You contacted Ingrid, told her where to find me." "I informed her of your return, yes, as was my duty to an old ally of our village. Eric Ironforge was a friend to Ravenshollow before his death. I owed it to his daughter to let her know that her betrothed had finally come home. The casual cruelty of it stole Brynhild's breath. She had opened her heart for the first time in decades, had dared to believe that love might yet find her, only to discover that her tender hopes had been nothing more than pieces in Thorvald's political game. "Why?" she whispered. "Why go to such lengths to destroy something that brought harm to no one?" "Because order must be maintained," Thorvald replied. "Because when one woman decides she can choose her own husband, other women begin to think they can choose their own fates. Before long, daughters are refusing marriages their fathers arrange, wives are questioning decisions their husbands make. Chaos spreads like wildfire through the careful structures that keep our world stable." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You would have been a symbol, Brinhild, a dangerous example of what happens when women forget their place. I could not allow that." "And if she arrives to find him already married to another?" Einar asked quietly. "What then?" "Then the marriage would be void, and you would face her father's kinsman for breaking a blood oath. They take such things seriously. In the Northern Territories, seriously enough to pursue a man to the ends of the earth for justice." The weight of impossible choices settled on Einar's shoulders like a yoke of iron. Honor the old oath and abandon the woman who had chosen to love him, or keep faith with Brynhild and face the vengeance of Ingrid's family. Either path led to pain and loss. "There is another way," came a clear voice from outside the cottage. They turned to see a woman standing in the doorway, tall, proud, with flame-red hair braided with silver wire and eyes like winter sky. She wore traveling clothes of fine wool and fur, and the sword at her side was no mere ornament. Behind her stood warriors in mail and leather, their faces grim as storm clouds. "Ingrid," Einar breathed. "Einar Ironhand," she replied with a nod that held neither warmth nor hostility. "You look older, wearier. The years of exile have not been kind to you." "No kinder than they've been to anyone," he replied carefully. "I heard your father passed. He was a good man." He was. And in his final illness, he spoke often of the oath that bound you to our family. He died believing you would honor it, that his daughter would not be left unwed and unprotected in a world that shows little mercy to women alone. Thorvald stepped forward, sensing victory within his grasp. "Then you've come to claim what was promised. The blood oath stands. The contract is valid. The law is clear." But Ingrid's response surprised them all. The law may be clear, but the heart is not so easily commanded. She looked directly at Brynhild, studying her with the measuring gaze of a warrior evaluating an opponent. You are the woman who dared ask for what she wanted instead of waiting for it to be given. I am, Brynhild replied, lifting her chin despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Good. We need to talk, all of us together. This matter involves more than just law and duty. It touches on what it means to be a woman in a world made by men for men's convenience. Ingrid's smile was sharp but not unkind. I think you'll find I have thoughts on that subject. This is highly irregular, Thorvald protested. The law does not bend to accommodate women's feelings, doesn't it? Ingrid's hand moved to rest on her sword hilt, a gesture both casual and threatening. I am here to claim what is mine by right, as you say, but perhaps we should discuss what exactly I wish to claim and what I'm willing to surrender before we assume we know the contents of my heart. The cottage fell silent except for the sound of wind stirring the thatch overhead. 3 people bound by fate and law stared at each other, while Thorvald's carefully laid plans began to show the first hairline cracks of uncertainty. The blood oath ring still rested in Einar's palm, but for the first time since the messenger's arrival, Brinhild allowed herself to hope that the iron shackles of the past might not be as unbreakable as they seemed. The ancient lawstone stood in the center of Raven's-Hollow's great hall, like a monument to justice itself, carved from black granite. By masters whose names were lost to time, it rose twice the height of a tall man, its surface covered with runes that chronicled the laws and customs of their people across centuries. The stone had witnessed thousands of judgments, had been the final arbiter in disputes that shaped the fate of generations. Tonight it would decide the destiny of 3 hearts caught in the web of ancient promises and modern choices. The hall was packed beyond capacity. Word of the unprecedented situation had spread throughout the northern settlements, drawing witnesses from villages days away. Traders, warriors, farmers, and fishermen crowded the space, their voices creating a low buzz of anticipation. The air was thick with smoke from the great hearth and heavy with the scent of too many bodies in too small a space. Brinhild sat on a wooden bench near the front of the hall, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. She had braided her hair with extra care and wore her finest dress, a deep blue wool that had been her mother's. But she felt small and insignificant beneath the weight of so many staring eyes. Beside her sat Ingrid, the woman who held the power to destroy or deliver her dreams. They had spent the afternoon in careful conversation, 3 people bound by impossible circumstances, trying to find a path through the maze of law and tradition that enclosed them. What they had discovered there gave Brynhild reason for hope, but also for deeper fear than she had ever known. Einar occupied the defendant's seat, a massive oak chair that had been carved specifically for those facing judgment. Despite his imposing size, he looked diminished by the grandeur of his surroundings, worn down by the weight of choices that had followed him across 15 years of exile. At the hall's head sat Thorvald on his chieftain's throne, resplendent in his finest clothes and gold arm rings. His blue eyes surveyed the assembled crowd with satisfaction, confident that tonight would see the restoration of proper order and the end of this unseemly challenge to his authority. Elder Seagrid rose from her place among the village women, her silver hair gleaming in the firelight. Despite her great age, her voice carried clearly through the crowded hall as she began the ancient ritual. We gather under the eyes of the gods and the witness of the lawstone to settle a matter of marriage. Oath and honor. Let all who speak here speak truth, for lies spoken in this sacred space will be known to Odin and punished accordingly. She turned to face the lawstone directly, placing her weathered hands against its ancient surface. Great stone, you who have stood sentinel over our justice since the founding of this village, hear our plea. Guide us to wisdom, that our judgment might serve both law and righteousness. The formality of the moment settled over the assembly like a cloak, transforming the crowded hall into something approaching a temple. These were rites older than memory, customs that bound their people to the gods and to each other across the generations. Thorvald Ironson, chieftain of Raven's Hollow, Seagrid continued, you have called this assembly. State the matter that requires judgment. Thorvald rose with the fluid grace of a man born to command. His voice filled the hall effortlessly, trained by years of addressing warriors and giving orders in battle. Honored elders, witnesses, and people of Raven's Hollow, we face a situation without precedent in our history. A woman of this village, Brinhild the healer, has openly proposed marriage to a man, an act contrary to all custom and tradition. Moreover, the man in question, Einar Ironhand, is bound by blood oath to another, making any such union impossible. Under law, he paused, letting his words sink into the minds of his listeners. I call upon this assembly to uphold the ancient ways, to reject this unseemly proposition, and to see that lawful obligations are honored before personal desires. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some approving, others uncertain. Brinhild felt her cheeks burn with the familiar shame of being the subject of public judgment, but she kept her spine straight and her chin lifted. Elder Bjorn stood next, his blacksmith's frame imposing even in this gathering of notable men. I would speak for Brynhild the healer, he announced, his voice carrying the authority of honest labor and respected craft. She has served this village faithfully for 20 years, bringing life into the world with her own hands, healing the sick, easing the dying. Her skills have saved more lives than any warrior's sword. Her wisdom has guided more families than any leader's counsel. If such a woman chooses to speak her heart openly, then perhaps we should listen with the respect her service has earned. The crowd stirred at this unexpected support from one of the village's most respected men. Thorvald's eyes flashed with anger, but he remained seated, allowing the ritual to proceed. Ingrid rose from her place beside Brinhild, and the hall fell silent. She was striking in her warrior's bearing, tall and proud with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear authority of a woman accustomed to being heard. I am Ingrid Eriksdottir, daughter of Erik Ironforge and heir to his lands and honors. I come here not as some men might expect, not as a woman wronged seeking justice for broken promises. I come instead as someone who understands what it means to be bound by the choices of others, and who believes it is time for that to change. She held up the blood oath ring so all could see it, the black iron gleaming dully in the firelight. This ring represents a promise made when I was 7 years old, a contract sealed by my father and Einar's without consulting my wishes or desires. I have spent 23 years of my life bound by that promise, waiting for a man I barely knew to claim me like property won in a trade agreement. Her words sent a shock through the assembly. This was not the speech anyone had expected from a woman come to claim her rightful husband. But I am no man's property, Ingrid continued, her voice growing stronger. I am a free woman of the northern lands, daughter of jarls, trained in the arts of war and governance. I have managed my father's estates, led his warriors, and proven myself worthy of respect in my own right. I did not travel here to collect a husband like a debt owed, but to offer a different way forward, one that honors both law and choice. Thorvald could contain himself no longer. He shot to his feet, his face dark with fury. This is madness. You cannot simply dissolve blood oaths because they inconvenience you. The law exists to provide order, stability, continuity. Without it, we descend into chaos, where every person follows their own whims, regardless of consequence. The law exists to serve the people, Elder Seagrid replied sharply, not to chain them to promises made in their names before they were old enough to understand their meaning. Tell me, Thorvald, what benefit does the village gain from forcing unwilling hearts into unwanted unions? The benefit of knowing that oaths mean something, that promises once made will be honored, that children can trust in the wisdom of their elders, and the stability of established custom. And what of the benefit of happiness? Asked a new voice from the crowd. All eyes turned to see who had dared interrupt the formal proceedings. It was Astrid, the blacksmith's daughter, her young face flushed with nervousness but bright with determination. What of the benefit of love freely given rather than duty grudgingly performed? What of the benefit of children born to parents who chose each other rather than were forced together? What of the benefit of showing young women that their voices matter, that their choices have weight, that they are more than goods to be bartered by fathers and claimed by husbands? The child speaks wisdom beyond her years, Ragnhild called out from among the older women. I bore 3 children to a husband I barely tolerated, buried 2 of them before they saw their 5th winter. Perhaps if I had been allowed to choose a man I could love instead of one my father found profitable, those babes might have thrived in a house filled with joy instead of duty. The voices joined the chorus, women who had known arranged marriages, men who had watched their daughters married off to secure alliances, elders who remembered different times when customs had been less rigid. The careful order of the formal assembly began to give way to something more chaotic, but perhaps more honest. Through it all, Einar remained silent in his judgment seat, his dark eyes moving from face to face as the debate swirled around him. Brinhild wondered what thoughts moved behind that weathered brow, what calculations he made as he weighed honor against happiness, duty against desire. The lawstone loomed over them all, its ancient runes seeming to pulse with life in the shifting firelight. Somewhere in those carved lines lay the answer to their dilemma, if only they could find the wisdom to read it correctly. As the hour grew late and the arguments more passionate, Brynhild felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a cloak. Tomorrow would bring resolution one way or another. Either she would wake as a woman free to choose her own fate, or she would return to her cottage alone, carrying the bitter knowledge that love was a luxury she would never be permitted to claim. But tonight, surrounded by voices raised in defense of choice and change, she allowed herself to believe that even ancient laws might bend before the combined will of hearts brave enough to demand better. The speaking staff had been carved from ash wood, blessed by 3 generations of law speakers, its surface worn smooth by countless hands that had held it while seeking justice. Runes of truth and wisdom spiraled up its length, and at its head perched a carved raven, Odin's messenger, keeper of secrets and herald of fate. Elder Seagrid raised the staff high above her head as dawn light filtered through the great hall's smoke hole, casting long shadows across the assembled crowd. The night had been spent in debate and deliberation, voices raised in passion and reason, arguments that had tested the bonds of community and tradition. Let the final testimony begin, she announced, her voice carrying the weight of ritual and law. Who would speak first before the lawstone renders its judgment? Thorvald rose immediately, his golden hair gleaming in the early light. He moved to stand before the ancient stone with the confident stride of a man who had never doubted his place in the world's order. I claim the staff first, as is my right as chieftain, he declared, taking the sacred object from Seagrid's hands. The carved raven seemed to regard him with knowing eyes as he lifted it high. People of Raven's Hollow, honored guests, keepers of law and custom, hear me now as I speak for order against chaos, for tradition against the destructive winds of change. What we decide here today will echo through generations yet unborn. Will they say we were wise guardians of the ways that have served our people for centuries? Or will they curse us as the generation that allowed feeling to triumph over duty, that chose momentary happiness over lasting stability? His voice filled the hall, trained by years of command to carry authority and conviction. Brinhild the healer is a woman of skill and virtue. None dispute this. But skill does not grant the right to overturn law. Virtue does not permit the abandonment of custom. A woman may not propose marriage to a man any more than a thrall may challenge a jarl to single combat. The natural order exists for reasons Our ancestors understood, even if we have forgotten them in our softness and prosperity. Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the crowd, particularly among the older men who had built their lives around the certainty of established hierarchy. And what of blood oaths? Thorvald continued, his gaze finding Einar in the judgment seat. Shall we say that promises made before gods and witnesses mean nothing when they become inconvenient? Shall we tell every young warrior that his word is only binding when it suits his desires? The blood oath ring bears runes of binding older than this village, older than memory itself. To break such bonds is to invite the gods' wrath upon our entire people. He turned to face Ingrid directly, his expression softening with what might have been genuine concern. Lady Ingrid, daughter of Eric Ironforge, you speak of freedom and choice as though they were the highest virtues. But what of honor? What of the duty we owe to those who came before us? Your father sealed that oath with his lifeblood, believing it would secure your future and strengthen the bonds between our peoples. Would you now say his wisdom was worthless, his love for you misguided? The staff trembled slightly in his hands, and for a moment uncertainty flickered across his features. But he pressed on, his voice regaining its earlier strength. I do not speak from cruelty or desire for power. I speak from fear, fear of what we become when every person decides for themselves what laws to follow, what customs to honor, what duties to accept. We have seen such chaos in other lands, where every village wars with its neighbors, where no oath can be trusted, where the strong prey upon the weak without restraint of law or tradition. He lowered the staff, his final words delivered with quiet intensity. Choose carefully, people of Raven's Hollow. The fate you decide today will shape the world your children inherit. Thorvald placed the speaking staff back in Seagrid's waiting hands and returned to his seat, his arguments hanging in the air like storm clouds heavy with rain. The hall had grown quiet, the weight of his words settling over the assembly like a blanket. Who would speak next? Seagrid asked. Brinhild rose slowly from her seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent the sleepless night preparing for this moment, choosing words with the care of a healer, selecting herbs for a crucial remedy. Everything depended on what she said now, not just her own happiness, but perhaps the future of every woman in the hall. She walked to the lawstone on unsteady legs, aware of every eye following her movement. The ancient granite seemed to pulse with life beside her, thousands of years of wisdom locked in its carved surface. Seagrid extended the speaking staff toward her, and Brynhild reached out to take it. The ash wood was warm from Thorvald's grip, and she felt the weight of all the voices that had held it before, law speakers and petitioners, accusers and defenders, all seeking justice in an imperfect world. The carved raven at the staff's head caught her eye, and for a moment she could have sworn it moved, tilting its head to regard her with something that might have been encouragement. I am Brynhild, daughter of Ragnar and Astrid, healer to this village for 20 years, she began, her voice stronger than she had dared hope. I stand before you not to destroy the law, but to ask what justice truly means. The unity chalice gleamed like captured starlight in Elder Seagrid's weathered hands, its silver surface reflecting the faces of those who had gathered to witness what none had believed possible. The ancient vessel had blessed countless unions over the centuries, filled with mead that symbolized the sweetness of shared life and the strength that came from hearts joined in purpose. The council has spoken, Seagrid announced, her voice carrying across the hushed hall. By vote of the assembled elders and testimony of the lawstone itself, we find that ancient law supports the right of any free person to propose marriage, regardless of their station or sex. The blood oath is declared void, broken by the deception that created Einar's exile in the first place. A roar of approval rose from many in the crowd, while others sat in stunned silence. Thorvald's face had gone pale as winter snow, his carefully constructed arguments crumbling like a wall built on sand. Beside him, his supporters looked around uncertainly, suddenly aware that the world they had known was shifting beneath their feet. But it was not victory that filled the hall, not yet. There remained one final choice to be made, one last question to be answered by the hearts involved rather than the law that governed them. Elder Seagrid turned to Einar, who had sat silent through hours of testimony and debate. Einar Ironhand, you are free of all previous obligations, released from bonds that were forged through treachery rather than honor. The choice now lies before you, unencumbered by duty or fear. What do you choose? The great hall held its breath as Einar rose from the judgment seat. He was a mountain of a man, scarred by battles and worn by years of wandering, but in this moment he seemed transformed, no longer the broken exile, but a warrior who had finally found something worth fighting for. I choose, he said, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the hall. The woman who saw worth in a discarded soldier, who offered her heart when she had every reason to guard it, who dared to speak words that no woman before her had ever dared voice. His eyes found Brynhild's across the crowded space. I choose Brinhild the healer, if she will still have a man who has brought her nothing but trouble since the moment she knelt beside him. The hall erupted in cheers and celebration, but Brynhild heard none of it. Her world had narrowed to the space between herself and the man who had just chosen her above duty, above convenience, above everything that the world had taught him to value. She walked to him through the crowd that parted like water before her, her heart so full it seemed impossible that her chest could contain it. When she reached him, he took her hands in his, and she marveled at how perfectly they fit together, her healer's fingers intertwined with his warrior's scars. And I choose you, she said, her voice thick with tears she made no attempt to hide. Einar Ironhand, who carries gentleness alongside strength, who chose exile rather than compromise his honor, who saw in my garden a place where broken things might grow whole again. Ingrid stepped forward then, and the hall quieted to hear what the woman who had traveled so far might say. Her face was serene, touched with something that might have been relief. I release you both from any claim I might have made, she declared. And I ask your blessing as I announce my own choice, to marry Bjorn Strongarm of my father's guard, a man who has won my heart through years of loyal service and gentle devotion. We will wed when the spring returns, if his courage in love proves equal to his bravery in battle. Laughter rippled through the hall at this, warm and approving. Here was a story within a story. Another couple who had found their way to happiness through the courage to speak their hearts. Elder Seagrid raised the unity chalice high above her head, its silver surface catching the light like a beacon. Let the ancient rites be observed, she called. Let mead blessed by our ancestors seal the union that law and love have made possible. The chalice was filled with golden mead, sweet with honey and strong with the fermentation that turned simple ingredients into something greater than the sum of their parts. Seagrid spoke the old words over it, prayers to gods who had watched over such ceremonies since the world was young. Drink, and let your lives be joined as this mead joins sweetness with strength, as your hearts have joined hope with courage. Brinhild took the chalice first, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The mead was warm and rich on her tongue, tasting of summer meadows and golden afternoons, of all the sweetness life had denied her until this miraculous day. She passed the chalice to Einar, and he drank deeply before returning it to her hands. Together they held it, silver reflecting their joined faces, two lives that had wandered separate paths, finally converging at the place where love and law could coexist. Before gods and witnesses, Elder Seagrid proclaimed, I declare you wed, according to the ancient customs of our people. May your union bring blessing to this village and hope to all who dare to choose their own destinies. The hall exploded in celebration as the unity chalice made its way through the crowd, each person drinking to toast the couple who had changed everything simply by having the courage to ask for what they wanted. The new hearthstone bore both, their names carved deep into its surface, Brinhild and Einar, joined forever in runes that would outlast their mortal bodies. It rested at the center of their shared home, a cottage expanded with loving care to accommodate two lives grown into one. The stone was warm beneath Brynhild's hands as she knelt beside it, tending the fire that had burned without interruption. For a full year now, 1 year since the day she had knelt beside a broken warrior and asked the unthinkable question. 1 year since she had chosen love over loneliness and found, to her wonder, that love had chosen her in return. The cottage had grown in that year, room added to room, as Einar's skilled hands shaped wood and stone into something larger than either of them could have imagined alone. What had once been a spinster's sparse dwelling now hummed with the warmth of shared life, his battle-scarred weapons hanging beside her healing tools, his massive boots resting companionably next to her worn leather slippers. A new garden flourished behind the house, twice the size of the old one. Here Einar had proven as skilled with growing things as he had once been with destroying them. His gentle touch with seedlings had surprised no one more than himself, and together they had created something that served the entire village, a place where healing herbs grew alongside vegetables that fed the hungry, where beauty existed not for its own sake, but for the joy it brought to all who saw it. "The bread is ready," Einar called from the kitchen, his deep voice carrying the contentment that had replaced the hollow emptiness she remembered from their first meeting. He appeared in the doorway, flour dusting his dark hair, looking nothing like the feared warrior of old songs, and everything like the husband she had dared to dream of. Brinhild rose from her place by the hearth, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their child grew. At 41, she had thought herself long past the age of bearing children, but the gods apparently had more surprises in store for a woman who had learned to expect the unexpected. "The blessing feast is ready then," she said, moving to help him arrange the simple meal they would share before their guests arrived. Today marked not just their wedding anniversary, but the celebration of changes that had rippled far beyond Ravenshallow's borders. Word of the healer who had chosen her own husband had spread along every trade route, carried by merchants and travelers to villages across the northern lands. 3 other women had followed Brynhild's example in settlements along the coast, each speaking her heart openly rather than waiting for someone else to choose her fate. The old ways were changing. Slowly but surely, one bold question at a time. Young Astrid had been the first to benefit from this new understanding. When the spring came, she had announced her intention to marry for love rather than alliance, and her father, perhaps inspired by Brynhild's example, had given his blessing. Her wedding to a young fisherman had been a celebration of joy rather than duty, and the happiness that radiated from the young couple had convinced even the doubters that love might indeed be a firmer foundation than gold. The door opened to admit their first guests, elder Seagrid, moving slowly now but still bright with intelligence and wisdom, and behind her Ragnhild, whose silver hair was crowned today with flowers in honor of the celebration. "How does the child fare?" Seagrid asked, settling into the chair Einar had built specially for her visits. Her eyes were gentle on Brynhild's rounded form, filled with the joy of a woman who had helped birth half the village and knew the miracle of new life better than most. "Strong and active," Brinhild replied, her hand moving unconsciously to where, small feet pressed against her ribs. "Einar swears he can feel the child's warrior spirit already." "Or her healer's restlessness," Einar added with a smile. "Either way, this little one has opinions about the world and isn't shy about expressing them." More guests arrived as the afternoon progressed. Bjorn came with his family, his daughter Astrid glowing with her own pregnancy, her fisherman husband proud beside her. Ingrid made the journey from her northern home with her new husband, their own joy evident in every shared glance and gentle touch. Even some who had opposed the union initially came to offer their congratulations. Change, Brinhild had learned, was often feared more in anticipation than in experience. The sky had not fallen when women began choosing their own paths. The village had not descended into chaos when tradition bent to accommodate love. Only Thorvald was absent from the celebration. His exile had been brief, 6 months in distant lands to contemplate the difference between leadership and tyranny. He had returned changed, quieter, less certain of his right to control others' choices. He ruled still, but with a lighter hand. And if he resented the changes that had come to Ravenshollow, he had learned to keep such feelings to himself. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Brinhild stood in her doorway, watching her guests enjoy the feast spread in her garden. Children played among the herb beds while their parents shared stories and laughter. Couples sat close together, some bound by old arrangements, others by new choices, all united in their commitment to making their unions work, regardless of how. They began. Einar appeared beside her, his arm coming around her shoulders with the easy affection of a year's worth of shared mornings and whispered conversations in the dark. "Any regrets?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "The answer, only one," she replied, leaning into his solid warmth, "that I waited 40 years to find the courage to ask for what I wanted. And now." Brynhild looked out at the scene before them, at the friends who had become family, at the village that had learned to bend rather than break, at the future growing beneath her heart, and smiled with the deep satisfaction of a woman who had finally claimed her place in the world. "Now I understand that it's never too late to plant new seeds," she said, echoing the words she had spoken to him in her garden that first day. "Some things are worth waiting for, even if the waiting teaches us to value them more when they finally arrive." The hearthstone behind them radiated warmth through the cottage, their names carved deep in granite that would endure long after their mortal bodies returned to the earth. But the true monument to their love was not carved in stone. It lived in the changed hearts of everyone who had witnessed their courage, in the women who had found their own voices, in the understanding that the greatest traditions were not those that never changed, but those that grew stronger by embracing change when change served love. As twilight settled over Ravenshollow, Brinhild the healer rested her hand on her husband's chest and felt his steady heartbeat beneath her palm. She had chosen well and been chosen in return, and that was more than enough for any lifetime.